Think we're live?
Yeah, we're live. We'll give everybody another minute just to hit that 8 a.m. mark. Yeah, we're gonna go live now. So, all right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the Journey Stage 3 of the 10 stages of supply chain technology maturity. So, this is the process that we believe every organization or professional goes through before they realize real throughput. I am your host, Ali Raza, CEO and founder, and then we have Anzar Kamdar joining as our chief decision scientist at Throughput. So, if you remember the last few conversations been having, it's been all around data maturity and how to get people to that supply chain impact. Today, we're going to talk about the realization where a lot of customers, clients, people that we see hit after their ERP stage, which is that, hey, ERP is a bit of one size fits all. So what else is out there? Because I'm running a warehouse, I'm running operations, I'm running field maintenance, I'm running manufacturing. There must be systems out there that sort of fix our unique problems, and that's going to be the premise of this call, right? So, just to start out with the visualization, and then maybe I'll bring it down. Is I wanted to just talk about that car journey, right? So the first car we were just on the lease road. The second time we were on the highway. Now we're at that stage where suddenly we've identified a carpool lane. Say you're an electric vehicle, right? That gives you certain rights, at least in California, to drive on that lane. But it's still the destination to, in our opinion, nowhere in terms of value creation. In fact, we call this value wildcatting, right? So this is the step where you actually install systems in different places, hoping you're going to strike oil. So again, we'll talk about the situation, our experience with customers, how to get back on the throughput highway, the consequences of staying on this path, and the technologies. So with that, Unzer, maybe just let's talk through this, right? So we last left off with ERPs. You tell me when your head is typically turned towards a WMS, TMS. When do you typically see it in organizations?
Yeah, so as we mentioned last time with ERPs, their foundations were around financial control. Of course, there's different modules, and some of these systems that we're talking about can be included as part of a ERP. But let's talk about these systems, right? Because we only put a few of them in. There's all the acronyms possible. You have a warehouse management system, you have a transportation management system, a manufacturing execution system. Uh, the word in there that I feel is a bit misleading is the word management. And most organizations essentially move towards these systems, as you mentioned, when they have, some sort of, in their opinion, just like, they only work on a specific type of business. If we're talking about distribution, managing a warehouse, transportation, managing a fleet of cars or a fleet of trucks. I think these systems seem very appealing. And from what I've seen in most organizations, unfortunately, the organizations that purchase these systems think that they're essentially the most sophisticated software out there. And they're good at what they do, but it's just important to point out that they're not necessarily creating operational impact. And that's what we've seen.
Yeah, so let's move on to our customers, right? So typically, when do customers reach out to us? So, I mean, we recently had a retailer, or I guess a manufacturer of retail goods, reach out to us, and they're trying to figure out their WMS, TMS system. We have sometimes they reach out for visibility plays. So, what has been the typical experience of, 'cause customers have asked us about, hey, are you an MES, are you an ERP, etc. When do they typically reach out, and where are they typically stuck?
Yeah, so when customers and prospects reach out to us, since we're solving the operational problem, they also assume that we come with the WMS layer, which is essentially the ability to be able to check in and out items. And that's because they're under the impression that those systems would solve their operational problems. I can give an example of one of our customers where we were trying to solve their, let's say, warehouse shifts and their picking rates because that was their operational metric. And what we had to do was essentially connect the TMS to the WMS. The reason we had to do that was the information about what sort of loads were inbound was sitting in the TMS, and the WMS was simply just tracking the slotting and the picking. And that's kind of where most organizations are stuck, because once they buy these systems, and if you want to look at a commercial example of this, if you're trying to solve let's say baggage handling for an airline, the system that you use to actually book the tickets or check people in or out is not necessarily what's going to solve that problem for you. And there seems to be a confusion that when you have the word management and the word warehouse in it, people assume that it's automatically covering all the activities and all this everything that you're going to need is going to be in these systems. And again, just to be clear, these systems do come with these sort of capabilities as add-ons and modules, same as we saw with the ERP systems. But unfortunately, what we've realized is, just based on talking with our actual customers and being in warehouses ourselves, even if the technology itself says that it's going to have dynamic slotting capabilities, no one's actually using that. Eventually, people are actually doing it outside, creating some cute data science project using these systems, just like with ERP, as systems of records to take the transactions and do their analysis on top of it, or buying further systems for these capabilities that are missing.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail there, right? So it's really management of data. It's really not management of your operations. And I think this is a big disconnect with a lot of these capabilities. And that includes real-time visibility as well. I'll throw that in there, even industrial IoT. So to your point, right? Right now, there's a lot of hype around AI-powered WMS, AI-powered TMS. Speak to me on that, right? Because obviously the big chip manufacturers and the GPU, providers are going to push this agenda. Why can we not just jump to AI WMS and solve this issue, right? What is still missing, I guess, from going to the next level?
That's a great question, right? So now we're getting agentic infused WMSs and AI powered WMSs, the intelligent warehouse, something similar to akin to a digital twin. But the underlying architecture and what the problems that these systems were solving for, let's say in the 80s and 90s, haven't necessarily changed. As you mentioned, they're more akin to being able to check in and out items and figure where things out or where things are, provide some sort of visibility, whether on the TMS or WMS side, but not necessarily help you focus on what's keeping your operations constrained. In reality, those sort of things are being solved with dashboards inside the warehouse, meetings and things like that. So most of these systems, as you mentioned, are disconnected from the actual operational workflow. And it gets even trickier when we start talking about TMS systems. You could start planning what your loads are, but things change. A lot of that information is not necessarily in your control. You can tie in APIs from different carriers, if you don't actually manage your own fleet. But all of a sudden, if you just think about how these systems were designed as very centralized systems, and when you start talking about where the decision boundaries as well as where your data boundaries end, these systems have not necessarily evolved. You're essentially just putting lipstick on a pig and now just adding AI to a very centralized system, when what you need is essentially a newer technology that is able to both be interoperable with your own systems internally, but as well as the other players in the supply chain.
To your point, right? So I equate this to trying to find oil, right? Which is, okay, we know there's oil underneath the ground. There's going to be value if we are able to extract it. But part of the exploration phase includes wildcatting, right? So the right way to do it is do like a analysis, a survey, figure out where that opportunity is, and then drill down that way. However, just picking a WMS, TMS, MRO, you name it, right? If you're making the assumption that you are the constraint of the organization, or you are the bottleneck, or maybe you're the only part of the business, then that makes sense. But if you're a large organization and you go about just installing AI and MES and WMS and TMS, and we'll get to agents and AI in a couple of weeks, right? That's a whole different thing with the valves. The biggest problem, at least I've seen in the last 10 years, is we call it value wildcatting, at least, or throughput wildcatting, which is we're just oil. If you know the statistics, 1 out of 9 drills strike oil, right, when you're exploring. So you're basically working on those odds. Maybe you get extremely lucky and then you hit it the first time and you have massive throughput gains because you were at the constraint of the organization. But most times it's not the case, right? So talk me through that. I mean, I got this question from World Economic Forum in an email last week, and I almost didn't respond, but I had to, which is like, how do you make sure you're focusing on the right bottlenecks, right? Obviously, like we can take the master data, find it, and say, hey, this is where you need a WMS, TMS. But walk me through like what the process should be to be selecting a WMS, TMS, because some people will go down this road, right?
Yeah.
I mean, their thing is like, hey, my competitor uses a TMS, WMS. I used to use it. It was easier to track stuff, especially invoices, right, and stuff coming in and out. So if your decision is, you know what, I need a TMS, WMS, I want an iPhone, period. I just want an iPhone, that's it. What's the right way to go about picking these systems?
So again, I did not want to, necessarily disparage these systems. They're good at what they do, but at the same time, as you just mentioned, right? You're using the term wildcatting. What I've seen in this space is that people are just throwing darts essentially at a dartboard and hoping one of these technology systems will solve all their problems. And what most of us know from this space is that all technology can do is accelerate your underlying process and your underlying systems. And if you're just hoping that a technology provider or whatever system you choose will fix your warehouse throughput or will fix how you're handling your transport fleet, again, caveat, because there are certain technology providers that are able to do that. But if you are an organization looking for these technologies, it might be worth it to first understand that. And again, I'm just trying to qualify here. We do work with people that have done these sort of implementations on the IT side. You have to define what is the business goal or the operational metric that you're looking to improve. And instead of going through some vendor checklist, these are the features that we need based on some market terms that you need to understand if those solutions will actually solve that for you. And this seems to be missing in this space simply, and just gonna call out how it is. Even when you are able to implement these systems, what we've seen as far as the metrics when you're looking to integrate these systems are around uptime, system availability, but not necessarily any sort of operational metric itself. So how are you qualifying the success for these systems and how they're installed? And this is where I would think the operation should be, involved. But just to, bring it back to your question, what is your organizational constraint? What is preventing you from fulfilling more demand? That question should be your North Star. Is it truly warehousing capacity? Is it truly warehousing speed? Is it, visibility? And I feel like all these ideas sound good. And for certain organizations, that might be the case. But how many people are able to run their operations better just due to better visibility? Some, possibly, but that's still the person themselves running it. And the way that you're looking to buy these systems, from what I've seen, is that these systems will handle all of that for you, and you don't have to worry about your underlying operational processes, your discipline around the data that you enter. And I think that's essentially the big disconnect here.
Yeah, I mean, I think publicly on LinkedIn, I called it the biggest grift of our time. But to be fair, right, the WMS MES system, if pointed to the right choke point, could be valuable. Unfortunately, it's typically not done that way. And to your point, right, some of the metrics, especially I've seen out of Dubai, has been, oh, we've 100% implemented this system. Congratulations. And what does that really mean? Okay, it's all in place. It's live. So IT can celebrate that win. But if it's not having any impacts to operations, like what's the point? So how did these systems come about, and is there a way around it, right? I mean, I'd figure, okay, so yeah, we need more organization at the manufacturing level, and it helps to be tracking. I mean, I hate to use OEE, but some companies use OEE as a true north. But tracking cycle times, in, outs, quality. This is useful information to the local level. So what is the alternative if you don't have an MES system? Do you track that on an Excel sheet? Because that doesn't also make sense.
I mean, we've seen companies track it on whiteboards. It just depends on what sort of, let's say, decisions you're making. We're talking about MES and OEE metrics. Is the uptime of your machine essentially, is that the constraint to you fulfilling more demand? Is it your product mix? What are you scheduling? What are you planning? And having an idea of the machine's statuses and what they're producing and what's been executed as far as a production order is great. but it does not necessarily change decisions or create any sort of operational impact. If you're producing the wrong things, you're just filling up warehouses for which you will need a WMS. It's not necessarily, giving corrective actions on what you should be doing that makes you more money or makes your operation better.
And at that point, right, Anzur, so when we start off on this journey with MES, TMS, WMS, we're talking about 2018,
Yep.
right? Or maybe even 2017. So it's taken up till 2026. I think this is the first generation of startups or companies I'm seeing where they're actually, maybe because it's younger founders, newer thinking, more technically enabled companies, especially on the defense side, I'm seeing companies implement MES, WMS, TMS, ERP from day one, right? And obviously raise at multi-billion valuations. Talk to me about the value of doing that, right? Versus what Elon Musk discovered around 2017 was like, I can automate every part of my factory out, but to increase throughput, I'm actually going to have to set up a third line in a tent, right?
Yep.
So have things changed, or are we in that generation where it makes sense to connect all the data from day one, put it at the core, sort of like using bottleneck detection at the core, or focusing on the constraint at the core to move things forward?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point, right? As to my previous example, if you buy these technologies looking to get your operation ready, I think that's the wrong way to go about it. Building them internally is not necessarily bad because, as we mentioned, it's very flimsy and vague what these technologies themselves claim to do and what they actually end up doing in organizations. The term management in the middle of TMS and WMS, I'm not sure if I agree with, but maybe if you're building that internally, it would be okay. You bring up Tesla, for example, where they ripped out specific, vendor provided systems and just decided to run with dashboards. I think the reason that worked was because it was connected to their actual operational end users. There was no IT in the middle, and hey, you're able to pull that data together however you need and start making better decisions. I think what we've seen is that once you actually have these IT systems, like these big brand name ones, you have to stand up a center of excellence in your organization, especially if you're a big multinational. All of a sudden, there's like data ownership and governance rights. And if you're in operations just trying to, figure out what's happening and what's come in, how many people do I need to staff? Sometimes that data is locked away. I've even seen it for third-party logistics providers where they don't actually own the data themselves in terms of what's coming in from the TMS systems, as in where the ASNs, what are we expecting as far as demand, and you don't know how many people to staff. And these are the sort of operational decisions that can be affected as a result of these systems just becoming more and more, let's say, entrenched from the perspective of you start creating these IT fiefdoms, essentially, that are disconnected from any sort of operational or business reality.
So, Anzur, I mean, this is just a form of supply chain ignorance as far as I'm concerned, right? So how do you bridge that gap? How do you get people to realize that this is not the way? I mean, we've been doing it for 9 years, certain success, limited success, I would say, right? To be honest, to get people to be like, hey, operationally, where is the throughput issue? And then focusing on the systems that can help track at that level to improve the flow. How does someone overcome this ignorance, right? Because in the US right now, it's all about digitizing. They're throwing agents on everything. And, companies are doing well. They're automating emails and spreadsheets and all sorts of things. There's value to that, right? But we're not really seeing a big throughput improvement in the overall GDP of the organization. I think one of our team members, Cameron, was over at speaking, with people at the Jamie Dimon event on Monday. They're running around JP Morgan right now looking for working capital improvements, all sorts of things, right? So speak to me on that.
That's a very big question, right? I feel we've been let down a bit just by the industry itself and the way that these technologies are sold and bought in these organizations. If the actual goal is to improve material flow or even the financial flow of your organization by being, fulfilling demand faster, why are these systems that are supposed to help provide the information for you just becoming information bottlenecks? And essentially, I mean, they do tend to, if you want to think about it this way, those centers of excellence All those consultants needed for implementations and all these softwares being sold do employ a lot of people. But from what I've seen, it doesn't necessarily help operations. It helps those vendors as well as, let's say, the back office people in those organizations. So if you're not actually helping the people that drive those decisions, operationally speaking, and are responsible for the P&L, you shouldn't be surprised if your organization's just, mucking around with innovation projects, cute data science projects, and, these system integrations.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first year. I was at Berkeley AI Agentic Summit last week, right? So this is the first time I saw anyone say, "Yeah, we have to use AI to impact the P&L." Marker's CEO did a good job, or I think co-founder, talking about how that needs to be done with agentic AI. But yeah, it boils down to the question of like, what have you guys been doing in the back office for all these years, right? And again, I emphasize that this is like the biggest grift in industrial operations in general, where you get sold stuff that has absolutely no impact to your endpoint, right? So on that note, right, I mean, we're seeing the GPU powered companies like Nvidia being one, trying to build the warehouses of the future, et cetera. But let's go back to like journey stage one, right? Where if the data is not being collected and the culture is not there, what can like automated warehouses and ghost warehouses really do? Uh, when the operational foundations, the data collection foundations, and the overall true north is not being connected, right? Which is, hey, we need to fulfill demand faster. How do you bring that together?
I mean, we keep talking about hallucinations, from these LLMs. We're now translating those hallucinations to a physical layer. Because if you're making decisions and if you're or let's say if you're automating even physical decisions based on data that does not reflect reality, and especially systems that are not necessarily embedded to how the work is actually done, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So I guess, we've harped on this problem long enough, and, people are not going to change, right? It's hard to get people to see the world in a new way. I had a long conversation earlier this week regarding this with some of Ellie Goldrat's earliest team members and followers, right? So um, I guess, what can be done, right? I guess is okay. So say we want to do MES, WMS, TMS. How can throughput help? Is I guess is a good question, right? Because sometimes you can't convince customers. Some of them are going to be stuck with their MES implementation. Next week we'll talk about all the planning softwares and what they've been doing since 1984 or 1960. But like, where can throughput help if the decision is that, hey, we absolutely need to do MES, MRO, CVM plus, whatever nonsense it is, right? That people are convinced that, yeah, this is absolutely going to help us locally, but holistically, who knows?
So I think the advantage to our both our technology and team is that we have gotten exposure to all these systems. So we know the very specific targeted data that's needed from these systems. Let's say the minimum viable data that can actually affect operations. Let's put it that way. And it exists in every organization. It could be in a different format. It could be sitting in an ERP system. It could be sitting in Excel sheets. Uh, Depending on the effort required, we typically prefer a certain level of data collection maturity. And I think we have two streams where you're able to just, simply upload an Excel sheet and see where you are and what you can do just from an operational perspective. It's very simple, right? Like just a very siloed data set. Or we could actually hook into wherever you are, regardless of which system you're in, and start driving those decisions, right? And I think the newer AI plays are getting in on this as well, but I don't think they've built out, let's say, the operational logic and the workflows for these AI agents to query. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll be talking about this in some of the next stages.
Yeah, to that point, right? So typically, organizations, if they choose not to go to throughput, there are two other ways of getting to your end goal, right? One is like an organization that can bring together uh, different data, look at lead times, just do time phased array synchronization, like a DC array out of Dallas, right? And the second is that you just hire a strategy firm, an IT firm, and hope for the best, right? Which is what ends up happening, right? So, and ultimately they find the bottleneck and they say, look how much throughput is coming through this choke point, but it takes a lot, right? So that's like the alternatives, right? The biggest players in this place, I would say, are like Epicor, Blue Yonder, WMS, GMS, Ascend. Everybody who shows up with FreightWaves basically has some sort of TMS, WMS angle, right? So the vendors are out there, right? But I just think that maturity is just not where we're very fragmented as a supply chain. Most people are like, well, let us just get our house in order, right? So if my manufacturing is being tracked properly at my two like manufacturing facilities, I don't really care about the holistic supply chain, right? I don't care if like the parts not really ending up in an aircraft. Like as long as I take care of my stuff, everything should work out. Which is parts of like Invisible Hand from Adam Smith and Ibn Khaldun basically came up with that 300 years ago. Before that, right? But speak to me on that, right? Because MES, TMS typically they're brought in basically to get your house in order, right? That's how I look at these solutions. They're not really there to improve throughput, but like, what are the consequences where everybody just? I mean, the expectation is everyone should get their house in order, then, right? That's basically the disconnect. Which is some people get their house in order, some people don't get their house in order. So it just doesn't improve the overall throughput through the entire value chain of, say, a part trying to make it to the end of a plane, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we had the same conversation around ERPs. They eventually just become tracking systems and systems that you could audit, essentially historians. And now we essentially have these more specialized for warehouses, transport loads, manufacturing, what was produced, what was actually there. So they end up being used more around compliance rather than giving you a direction of where to go. I think it was good you brought up. We don't necessarily want to suggest that we're the only solution provider to help you get out of this rut. You brought up DCRA. That's pretty interesting because the same problem I described at the start, where we're trying to connect a TMS and a WMS just to figure out what to do inside of the warehouse. DCRA is very interesting simply because it's able to connect data at an ecosystem level, and it overcomes those barriers that I mentioned around centralized technology. Centralized technology now ported on the cloud and now infused with AI, simply because it's meant to work with your ecosystem and things outside of your organizational boundary, both from a data and decision perspective. And
To your
the
point,
other
right?
option is consultants. Yeah.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, there's always a connective tissue pitch, right? What I've seen typically is people will build connective tissue for TMS, but they wouldn't do it for a connective tissue between MES, TMS, WMS, etc. So either you bridge the gap with something like that, like a DC array or a throughput, right? We connect some systems as well, including Palantir for that matter. We'll speak about ontology in a couple calls from now. Or you go the consulting route or subject matter expert route, right, where they're sort of the bridge between the different systems. They know what data to look at. They know how to make the decision, what to pull from. And those are pretty much the two things, right? So I think from this call, what we wanted to get across was like, yeah, these things manage your invoices and numbers and metrics better, but these are not management systems, right? They're managing information. They're not managing operations. And that seems to be the big disconnect with how these systems are sold, right? And then how they're adopted, and then why we have poor success rates, right? So we should call a spade for what a spade is basically what we're advocating for here. And also look at maybe the next phase of what happens. So on the next call, since we're coming up on time, we're going to probably talk about I guess it makes sense to integrate these systems, right? So we've talked about DCRA, we've talked about consultants, but unfortunately what ends up happening is people go down the integrated business planning route. And we'll talk about the main systems. I know I have a call coming up where I have to explain to World Economic Forum about how we're different from Kinaxis, SAP, Oracle. I did send him a message saying, like, 9 years on, I can't believe we're answering these questions to subject matter experts, right? But that is the state of the industry, right? It's built on a lot of this IT hope, IT promises. Tracking is great, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a value improvement, incremental improvement once you do see things for the first time. You can clean up some stuff. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but using these systems to manage holistically, I think is a challenge. And the same thing goes for super consultants who understand whatever it is, theory of constraints, Deming, Toyota systems. It just has to be a hybrid of both to get the most value out of both systems.
Yep.
Your parting thoughts on these topics, Sanzer?
I mean, great points. Yeah, I mean, there's enough knowledge out there. I think the technology has already been around for a while. It's just we seem to keep repeating the same mistakes of the past, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's the key take, right? So, I mean, like, to your point, these systems have been around since IBM has been around, right? They maybe have not had the terms for marketing, right? It's sort of like everything is business, how everything was business intelligence. I mean, looking at pie charts and line graphs is not intelligence, right? I mean, it's like, oh, you have to sort of factor in and think about what the numbers mean. Same with LLMs and AI now. Yeah, I mean, it's synthesizing it and giving it to you in an easy way, depending on what questions you ask, right? And then that becomes a token question. So, but yeah, I mean, bottom line is Journey stage one was spreadsheets. Not a bad thing, but better things out there, right? If you want to look at it, or you can start there and you can start synchronizing, because really it's just matrix math that you're really looking at, right? Long term. Same with ERP. We spoke about that on Journey stage two. Talking about, invoice tracking is great. And then also for these specialized systems. So join us next week again, same time. We will be talking about integrated business planning. This is a topic that a lot of Fortune 500s are going through, government organizations are going through. Hopefully we'll be able to give our perspective on that as well. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you, Ansar, for your thoughts.
Thank you, everyone. Seems like we're live still. So
Yeah,
do we have any
we'll stick
questions?
around for a couple of minutes if there's any questions, but if not, we'll drop off. So